what started under Henry VIII as schism, for he did not actually lose the sacraments in the British Isles, but separated from the source of unity, became later on in time, after his death, heresy, and the sacraments were lost. We know that led to clandestine celebrations, not only in England itself, but also in Ireland. And it was in one of such that the saint of this day, important, was back at home in our area. John Roberts was caught. He was wearing vestments similar to these and following a rite similar to this. And at the last gospel, a bang was heard on the door, "Open up in the name of the King," and he carried on regardless. They bashed the door down and took him. Now, they'd already caught him and taken him before, more than once, but he'd always managed to wriggle out. This time, it may be that he felt that his time was come. He initially tried to get them to prove that he was a priest, but unexpectedly he changed his tone and declared, "Yes, I am a priest." And by that he was giving precisely the motive for his end. He was dying for his priesthood. But in the rite of being hanged, drawn and quartered as a traitor, there was this part of the execution in which the executioner would hold the extracted heart of the condemned criminal while it was still beating and say, "Behold the heart of a traitor," to which everyone was expected to reply, "God save the King." But in the case of John Roberts, no one did, for he had been helping greatly in the plague in London and was the friend of the poor, and they didn't have the same sentiments of hatred towards him as was expected and anticipated. He was from our area and would have had our own Welsh accent. I've actually celebrated in his home, Rhywgoch, near Trawsfynydd, near Gyllyn, where we had the Welsh Mass every month, and at the end of it we would sing to him in Welsh and also in English. We had a major relic of his, but the new bishop wanted these relics brought to the Curia in Wrexham, and a strange thing happened. The relic, hitherto maintained perfectly well all these centuries, started to disintegrate. I wonder why. He did miracles, and we knew his power of intercession, which is not surprising given the way that he shared the cross of the Lord. Being hanged, drawn and quartered was the maximum. Here he is, with the crown, the palm of martyrdom. Those who suffer martyrdom go like rockets to glory, for they are fully pulling on the power of Calvary, to which they are united physically, mentally, and in every possible way. And in his case, he was priest and victim at the altar of sacrifice. and he was one of the 40 martyrs canonized on the 25th of October 1970. I remember the occasion. We had a high mass in the grounds of the castle in Cardiff. And we could hear eventually the voice of St. Paul VI pronouncing in Latin the names of these 6 Welsh ones along with the other English ones. Sanctum Ioannem Roberts. He is there. And the first ones of the army are the Carthusian ones, which St. Thomas More, from his cell in the Tower of London, saw going. And as he did so, he said to Meg, his daughter, "See how they go, joyful as bridegrooms to the wedding." And he soon would follow, but because he was a friend of the king gave him this favour of only having his head removed, to which he calmly replied, "Heaven preserve the friends of the king from such a favour." When things had not worked out in France and also for a short while in Ireland, I returned to my studies. A letter came out of the blue from the Abbot of Prynich that I had known 10 years previously, and he was concerned. He eventually advised me to do a year's study, and then if I wanted to return to the Benedictine ambit, he advised me eventually to go to their daughter house, Farnborough, which they were trying to build up. And it was actually on this very day, the feast of St. John Roberts, that I was clothed, and I was given the name of John after this saint. Now, as it happens, St. Michael's Abbey, Farnborough, was a house built in part by the Benedictines of Solesmes, and they were there in exile and refuge, and it was in its time a place of liturgical excellence, a part of the liturgical movement with names associated with it, and that had been taken up and actually has continued under Dom Cuthbert, who was with me as a novice. And he has had the courage to revert to very monastic things, like the timetable in its fullness, with a very early night rise, and the altars as they were. All the celebrations for many years have been ad orientem, and he's gone back recently even further, and has gone to the old rite. So I admire Dom Cuthbert, and the Lord is blessing him, for they're starting to get vocations again. And it could be a place of importance for England, because it does offer the old rite to those who want something classical and cannot easily find it. The church itself is very beautiful, built by French money, and the echo is the best in England because of the dome over the high altar. Dom Cuthbert himself has a very good singing voice. Unfortunately, what happened was the novice master of the time, who had been Former's Xaverian brother, had a certain way of looking at things. He had made his vows at Prynich and then was transferred eventually to Farnborough, but he seemed to have the spirit partly of his formation, and he did not accept me easily, so it made it very difficult. Eventually left the order, but it's a pity in a way because there could have been, even at that point, a renewal going on, because there were people of quality around, one of which eventually was to be Dom Alcuin Reid, who was very much in the field of liturgical study and excellence, and he taught me how to celebrate a high mass in the old rite. All that is part of the mystery of providence, why these things happen and unhappen afterwards. But it is kind of important because one feels, having been in the family, something of the heirlooms of the family. And we used to get stories of things. We know, by the way, that there's a link between St. John Roberts and Downside. He actually was formed at St. Martin's Monastery in Compostela, but eventually English people regrouped in Douay in Belgium and did a lot of things in exile. The Douay-Rheims Bible was translated there. These eventually got back to England, and they, from there, St. Gregory's Monastery in Douay, where he was prior, became the monks of Downside. But there were things which happened, and at Downside they have, for instance, old things, including relics. So major relic of St. John Roberts there. They have also his charter of vows, perpetual vows. And they have the tiny persecution chalice, which has miraculous connotations. It was used in the Terreur in France. There's a story behind that one. And one feels the continuity. My own parish was run by Ampleforth, and certainly there one had the awareness of continuity. That was the other line coming down from the exile community in Douay-Rheims in France. Our brethren, therefore. And when the head of that monastery, Basil Hume, whom I know as abbot, he was made Archbishop and eventual Cardinal of Westminster, they had Vespers of Thanksgiving on the feast of his consecration, the 25th of March, in Westminster Abbey, which of course had been Benedictine in the same congregation, because it was Dom Sigebert Buckley who gave the rites of succession to two young men, the novices, and through them it carried on. So the English Benedictine congregation is the old one still. And he quietly muttered, because he was playing the organ, Dom Lawrence Bevan, or my spiritual father, when he got there before the others to welcome them, his brethren, he was going to do the organ as they sang quietly Vespers in Latin, he said simply, "Back again." It was their monastery by rights. And actually there had been a project kept quiet for years. The Cardinal Archbishop of Westminster was building the cathedral years ago, about a century ago or more now. He wanted Benedictines to be officiating there, and that's how the Benedictines came from Downside to Ealing. But when the secular clergy heard about the plan, they protested strongly and it wasn't allowed to be. But he was aware of the importance of the Benedictines in the history of England. And by the way, it works very well, for that serenity of praise and prayer and timelessness gives everything a certain serenity and gives God pride of place. St. John Roberts was aware because he had been an Anglican, and one time in the place where he'd been a student, St. John's College, Oxford, I conciliated with our Bishop Edwin Regan in Welsh with Gregorian chant, at the altar where he would have prayed when he was a student. He discreetly disappeared from Oxford and went to France, and at Notre Dame in Paris was received into the Catholic Church. But he had been influenced already when he was growing up by a monk expelled from the closed Cistercian monastery Comer nearby where he was living, who taught him one or two things like Latin or whatever, and he became aware already at that point of the history that he was missing out on. But he became very much aware of it as a student. St. John's College has an old Catholic chapel, become Anglican, and he was uncomfortable because he was aware that although the trimmings were there, the essence was missing, and it was worth risking all for. He could have stayed quietly on the continent, but he risked more than once coming back to the British Isles, knowing what that probably meant. Now there's a reason. These people knew that Satan wanted to remove sacramental grace from the British Isles, and he was succeeding. It was looked at very carefully by Leo XIII, and in the bull Apostolicae Curae towards the end of the 1800s, 1896, thereabouts, it became quite clear that both the intention of transmitting the apostolic succession as a Catholic priesthood and the form were defective. Bishop Barlow was creating a Protestant minister, and the form was completely defective in which it was done. So the conclusion was that the orders transmitted were utterly null and completely void. So as John Roberts saw, this question meant a life choice. So now any young man thinking of giving himself to the Lord must ask this question: where must I go? Like St. Paul on the ground, Domine, quid vis me facere? Lord, what wilt thou have me to do? And he was told to get up and go to Damascus, and it would be told thee what thou art to do. So the way can be given by another in his name, but also the Holy Ghost himself will answer a question sincerely posed. Sincerely posed. My best friend in school and college days was the son of the Vicar of Cardiff and a High Anglican, and he was very close to becoming a Catholic. But there's a huge power in tradition and the family and the heritage. It's not quite so simple, but it does matter, because I saw him celebrating eventually after he was ordained. He had all the trimmings and more, but somehow I knew they are the trimmings. It's either there or not there. And John Roberts knew that it wasn't there. And to get the priesthood and the sacraments back to the impoverished British Isles, he was willing to be hanged, drawn and quartered. Let's not forget those who marched into glory via the Tyburn Hill, the last of which is miraculously preserved in part near here. His head is not just a skull. St. Oliver Plunkett, much later in time, 1681, can be seen in the dignity of an archbishop suffering at the same Tyburn tree, the same punishment of high treason. It was under James I that John Roberts went to glory in 1610. St. John Roberts, remember us in glory. Remember Wales in particular. He could not get back, and Wales needs the light of grace, the fullness of grace, the holy sacrifice, unchanged and standing over the rocking planet. vihen organos comiadi, aglavi grimid andon maestorois, aurendimus dego caneri volerois, emanam avaina besnot lebihoin, agras legim tu deliast maideroin, aglavi hem andam nader Rione with one, win Riogar with wind. Child of an earth, just father of a throne, dost thou this night recall to whom belong these parts of earth that once to him were wed? These silent cries, where once thy feet did tread, dost thou still hear the echo of this pause in ancient song that long flowed 'tween the pores of heavy stone, where buried lies our a patient spring, a loud familiar smile.